Arthur Miller, a 78-year-old Vietnam War veteran, entered the upscale restaurant Silver Leaf Dining with a sense of anticipation. He was wearing his best coat, a weathered blazer with his military pins on display. It was a rare occasion for Arthur to treat himself, and he had chosen Silver Leaf because of its reputation for excellent food and classy ambience. However, the moment Arthur stepped through the grand doors of the restaurant, he could sense the unease. As Arthur took a seat near the window, he admired the view of the bustling street and ordered a cup of coffee to start. The server nodded politely, but moments later, the manager, a middle-aged man named Harold, approached with a disapproving scowl. "Sir, I'm afraid this is not the right place for you," Harold said, his voice dripping with condescension. Arthur looked up, his face puzzled. "I'm just here for a meal. Is there a problem?" he asked calmly, though a knot began to tighten in his chest. "Before we continue, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave us a comment with your hometown, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt stories of resilience and community. Your support truly matters." Harold crossed his arms, shaking his head. "This establishment is meant for a certain class of clientele, and I'm afraid you don't quite fit in," he stated firmly, ignoring the polite smiles of the server standing nearby. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. The laughter and quiet conversations around them seemed to dim, and several patrons turned to watch the confrontation unfold. Arthur could feel his heart sink, but he wasn't one to back down. "I fought for this country," he said, his voice steady but filled with hurt. "I've earned the right to be treated with respect, just like anyone else." The room fell into an awkward silence, with waiters pausing and guests whispering to each other. Arthur's composure remained, but the tension was palpable, until someone unexpected decided to step in. Sitting just a few tables away, Margaret Collins, a well-dressed businesswoman in her late 50s, watched the interaction unfold, her face growing stern. She had been enjoying a celebratory lunch with her son, Thomas, who was in town after graduating from law school. But seeing Arthur being treated so unfairly stirred something deep inside her. Margaret glanced at Thomas, who nodded, silently encouraging her. Margaret rose from her seat and made her way toward Arthur's table. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "But this gentleman has every right to be here, just like anyone else." Her eyes fixed on Harold, and there was no mistaking the fire in them. "It's unacceptable to treat a veteran or anyone with such disrespect." Harold hesitated, visibly taken aback. "Ma'am, this is none of your business. We reserve the right to admit guests as we see fit," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. Margaret was not deterred. "You are making it everyone's business when you choose to discriminate," she said, her voice growing louder. "Who here thinks this man should be allowed to stay?" she asked, turning to face the room. The tension broke as a murmur of agreement rippled through the dining room. Slowly, a young couple stood up. "He should stay," the man said, nodding at Arthur. A server stepped forward, nervously but firmly adding, "I agree." One by one, other patrons started nodding and voicing their support for Arthur, until it was clear that the majority were against Harold's decision. Thomas joined his mother at Arthur's table, looking Harold in the eye. "This restaurant has a reputation, but today, it's the people here who are defining it," Thomas said. "And the kind of restaurant we support is one that stands for equality and respect." Harold's face reddened with embarrassment, and he glanced around the room, realizing he was outnumbered. With a begrudging sigh, he muttered, "Fine. Enjoy your meal." He turned and walked away, leaving Margaret, Thomas, and Arthur standing by the table, surrounded by supportive smiles. Margaret smiled at Arthur and gestured to an empty chair at her table. "Please, Mr. Miller, join us. It would be our honor." Arthur hesitated for a moment, taken aback by the kindness, but then nodded, his eyes glistening. "Thank you," he said softly. "It's not every day you meet people willing to stand up for a stranger." Thomas pulled out a chair for Arthur, and as the older man sat down, the rest of the restaurant seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Conversation slowly resumed, but the air was different, lighter, warmer. Margaret signaled the server, who returned with a smile, eager to make Arthur feel welcome. "I'll have another coffee for our guest here," she said, her voice gentle. Arthur glanced around, still processing the outpouring of support. "I can't tell you how much this means to me," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I never expected anyone to care this much." Margaret reached across the table, placing a hand over Arthur's. "We care because it's the right thing to do," she said, her eyes softening. "No one should be treated the way you were, especially someone who has given so much for others." Thomas nodded in agreement, his expression earnest. "You serve this country, Mr. Miller. That's something we all benefit from. The least we can do is make sure you're treated with the respect you deserve." As the server returned with Arthur's coffee, the atmosphere at the table turned more relaxed. Arthur shared a small smile, his fingers wrapping around the warm mug. "You know, I've faced many challenges in my life, but moments like this remind me of the good that still exists in the world," he said quietly. Margaret and Thomas listened attentively as Arthur began to share stories from his days in Vietnam. Stories of camaraderie, of hardship, and of resilience. Margaret was struck by the humility with which Arthur spoke. He never painted himself as a hero, but it was clear to everyone listening that his actions had been nothing short of courageous. Slowly, other patrons began to join in, asking Arthur questions about his experiences, expressing their gratitude, and sharing their own stories of family members who had served. The dining room, once tense and divided, became a place of connection. People were no longer strangers sharing a meal. They were a community, united by a shared belief in respect and kindness. As the conversation flowed, Harold watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. He could see the warmth spreading across the room, the way people were engaging with Arthur, and it made him pause. He had been so certain of himself before, so quick to judge, but now he saw something different, something he had not expected. Margaret glanced at Harold, catching his eye for a brief moment. She hoped that today's events might make him reconsider his actions, might open his eyes to the importance of compassion. But for now, her focus was on Arthur, on making sure he knew that he was valued, that he belonged. The afternoon continued, and what had started as a moment of conflict turned into a celebration of humanity. Arthur's laughter echoed through the restaurant as he shared a particularly amusing story, and the people around him laughed with him, their smiles genuine. It was a testament to the power of standing up, of choosing kindness over division. Margaret raised her glass, her eyes shining with emotion. "To Mr. Miller," she said, "and to all those who remind us of what truly matters: respect, courage, and community." The diners around them lifted their glasses in unison, a powerful symbol of unity in a moment that had begun with conflict. Arthur blinked back tears, lifting his own glass. "To good people," he said simply, and as the glasses clinked together, the dining room was filled not just with the sound of celebration, but with the feeling of hope. Hope that perhaps one small stand could inspire many others. Arthur joined Margaret and Thomas, and as they ordered their meal, the conversation flowed effortlessly. Arthur shared stories from his time in Vietnam, the camaraderie, the fear, and the moments that had defined his life. Margaret listened intently, her heart swelling with respect for the sacrifices he had made. Thomas, eager to learn, asked questions about Arthur's experiences, fascinated by the resilience and wisdom in his words. Slowly, the atmosphere in Silver Leaf Dining shifted from tense to warm. Conversations resumed, but now there was a different energy, an unspoken sense of connection among the diners. The servers brought out the food with more smiles than before, and even those who hadn't spoken up earlier showed their support through nods and kind glances. Arthur's stories painted vivid pictures of his past, of days spent in the thick jungle, of friends he had made and lost, and of the pride he had felt serving his country. His voice carried a blend of sorrow and strength, and as he spoke, Margaret felt a deepening admiration for him. Thomas listened, wide-eyed, taking in every word. He had always read about the war in history books, but hearing Arthur speak brought it to life in a way nothing else could. "You know," Arthur said, his eyes growing distant for a moment, "it wasn't just about the battles. It was about the bonds we formed. We were brothers, looking out for each other. And that sense of loyalty is something I carry with me every day." He looked at Margaret and Thomas, his eyes softening. "And seeing people like you stand up for what's right today, It reminds me that the spirit of looking out for each other is still alive. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand gently on Arthur's. We all need to look out for one another, she said. It's what makes us human. And it's people like you who inspire the rest of us to be better. The servers returned with their entrees, steaming plates of roasted chicken, seasonal vegetables, and rich, creamy mashed potatoes. As they dug in, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Arthur spoke of his late wife, Mary, and how she had been the love of his life. He shared stories of their adventures together, of how they had danced in the kitchen to old records and taken long road trips just to see the sunset from different places. Margaret smiled, picturing the scenes Arthur described. She sounds like she was an incredible woman, she said warmly. Arthur nodded, a gentle smile on his face. She was. She had a way of making the world feel a little bit brighter, no matter what was happening. Thomas, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. It sounds like you both lived a full life, Mr. Miller. It's inspiring to hear about your experiences, both the hard times and the beautiful moments. Arthur chuckled softly. Life has a way of giving you both, son. It's about finding joy even in the midst of hardship. That's what Mary always taught me. As the dessert was served, a decadent chocolate mousse, a young waitress approached their table nervously. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and her cheeks were flushed. Mr. Miller, she began, her voice almost a whisper. I want to apologize for what happened earlier. My grandfather was a veteran too, and it's people like you who make a difference in our lives. I'm so sorry you were treated this way. Arthur looked up at her, his expression gentle. He could see the sincerity in her eyes. Thank you, dear, he said, his voice kind. It's never too late to do the right thing. He gave her a reassuring smile, and the young waitress visibly relaxed, her shoulders dropping as she returned his smile. Margaret raised her glass of sparkling water. To those who stand up for what's right, to new friendships, and to making a difference, she toasted. Arthur and Thomas clinked their glasses with hers, and others around the room joined in the toast, raising their drinks in solidarity. It was a simple gesture, but it carried immense weight. The atmosphere in Silver Leaf Dining had transformed. What had started as a moment of division had turned into a celebration of unity. People who had been strangers just an hour before were now connected by a shared sense of purpose. They were reminded that sometimes, all it took was one courageous stand to bring people together. As the evening wound down, Arthur looked around the restaurant, his heart full. He had come to Silver Leaf for a quiet meal, but what he had found was so much more. A renewed faith in humanity, a reminder that even in the face of prejudice, there were still good people willing to stand up for what was right. And as he sat there, surrounded by new friends, Arthur knew that this was a meal he would never forget. The story of that day at Silver Leaf Dining spread quickly. Within days, it was shared on social media, reaching local news, and then making its way to larger outlets. The headline read, "Community stands together to support veteran against discrimination." The story struck a chord, resonating with people who understood the value of respect, regardless of background or social status. Margaret reached out to Arthur a week later. "Mr. Miller," she said over the phone, "I've been thinking, how about we organize a community event here at Silver Leaf to honor veterans? It could be a day to bring people together, to celebrate unity and respect." Arthur was touched by the suggestion. "I'd be honored," he replied. "It's important that people remember what it means to come together as a community." And so, Silver Leaf Dining held its first Veterans Appreciation Day. The restaurant was decorated with American flags, and photographs of local veterans were displayed on the walls, each with a short story of their service. Arthur stood proudly near the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived, shaking hands, and receiving heartfelt thank yous. Harold, the manager, stood by, watching the festivities with a reflective expression. He approached Arthur later in the day. "Mr. Miller, I want to sincerely apologize for my behavior. I've learned a lot in these past weeks. I see now that everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." Arthur nodded, placing a hand on Harold's shoulder. "Apology accepted," he said. "The important thing is that you're willing to change, and that's something to be proud of." The atmosphere in the restaurant that day was one of celebration and unity. People from all walks of life filled the tables: veterans, families, young children, and elderly couples. Margaret and Thomas had also arrived early to help set up, and they watched with pride as the restaurant bustled with activity. Margaret looked around the room, her heart swelling with joy at what they had accomplished. She turned to Arthur, who was deep in conversation with an older gentleman wearing a navy blue blazer adorned with service medals. "This is what community looks like," she said softly to Thomas. "People standing up for one another, lifting each other up." Thomas nodded. "It's amazing to see how something that started as a negative experience has turned into this," he said. "A place where people feel they belong." As the event continued, a small stage was set up in the corner of the restaurant. Margaret took the microphone and welcomed everyone, her voice filled with warmth and gratitude. "Thank you all for being here today," she began. "Today, we honor our veterans, those who have served and sacrificed for our country. But we also honor the spirit of community, the spirit of standing up for what is right and supporting one another." She invited Arthur to the stage, and the crowd erupted in applause as he made his way forward. Arthur stood at the microphone, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never expected what happened here a few weeks ago to lead to something like this," he said. "That day, I was reminded of the strength of ordinary people. People like Margaret, Thomas, and all of you who stood up for what was right. It's moments like these that remind us of the good that exists in the world." The crowd listened intently, many with tears in their eyes. Arthur continued, "We all have the power to make a difference, to show kindness, to extend a hand when someone needs it. That's what makes a community strong. And today, I am proud to be part of this community." The applause that followed was thunderous. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering for Arthur and for the message he shared. Margaret and Thomas joined him on stage, and together, they looked out at the crowd. A sea of smiling faces, united by a shared sense of purpose. As the event came to a close, Harold approached Margaret, a look of determination on his face. "I'd like to make Veterans Appreciation Day an annual event," he said, "and I want to do more. Offer discounts to veterans, host community dinners, and make sure that Silver Leaf is always a place where everyone feels welcome." Margaret smiled, her eyes shining. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Harold," she said. "It's never too late to make a change, and I believe this is just the beginning." Arthur, overhearing their conversation, nodded in agreement. "It's about building something lasting," he said, "a place where people know they're valued." The event ended with a sense of hope and renewal. People lingered, chatting and sharing stories, while children ran around, laughing and playing. The restaurant, once a place of exclusion for Arthur, had transformed into a beacon of unity and acceptance. As Arthur left that day, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew that the community had come together not just for him, but for something much bigger. They had taken a stand for respect, for kindness, and for each other. And as he walked out of Silver Leaf Dining, Arthur knew that this was a day that would be remembered, not just as a celebration of veterans, but as a testament to the power of standing together. Veterans Appreciation Day became a monthly event at Silver Leaf Dining. The restaurant, once known for its exclusivity, became a symbol of unity in the community, a place where everyone, regardless of their status, felt welcomed and valued. Margaret and Thomas continued to visit regularly, often inviting Arthur to join them, and they became close friends. The community responded positively to the changes. People from all walks of life began frequenting the restaurant, drawn by the story of what had happened and by the warmth that now radiated from the staff and patrons alike. Harold, now a changed man, took it upon himself to make Silver Leaf a beacon of inclusion and respect. One afternoon, as Arthur, Margaret, and Thomas sat together enjoying lunch, they noticed a young boy approaching an elderly veteran at another table, offering to help him with his coat. Arthur smiled at the sight, feeling a sense of pride and hope for the future. Margaret looked over at him, her eyes misting with emotion. "This is what it's all about," she said softly. Arthur lifted his glass, nodding. "To second chances, to community, and to the belief that we all belong." The three friends clinked their glasses, knowing that the legacy they were creating was one of compassion, understanding, and unity. a legacy that would last for generations. Silver Leaf Dining became more than just a restaurant. It became a symbol of positive change. People began to see it as a place where they could gather, share their stories, and feel a part of something greater. The story of Arthur's experience and the community's response became a beacon for others to stand up for what was right. Harold worked closely with Arthur and Margaret to organize more community events, from fundraisers for veteran support groups to free meals for those in need. Each event brought more people together, and the bonds within the community grew stronger. Arthur, who had once entered the restaurant feeling like an outsider, now felt like an honored guest, surrounded by friends and allies. As he looked around during one of the monthly events, seeing families laughing together and veterans being celebrated, he knew they had built something truly special. Margaret smiled at Arthur, placing a hand on his arm. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she said. Arthur nodded, his heart full. "Yes, we have. And it's just the beginning," he replied. In that moment, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and even those who had once doubted him, Arthur knew that they had created something that would endure. A community built on respect, kindness, and the simple belief that everyone deserves a place to belong.